all of these different things, because the second that you don't actually consider it as an issue, you're going to actually find yourself that and here's one very important thing, many times we would see within our uh, within our community different areas that would be talking about, for example, peace, tolerance, etc. Well, by tolerating injustice, that's not being tolerant. That's actually being tolerant towards the perpetrators. That's not being tolerant. Although many would want to present it like it's all about tolerance. But the second that you're tolerating oppression, that is giving more advantages for the oppressors over those that were victims and abused. It's that easy. And that's the same thing. When we're being tolerant over zina, that actually means you are tolerant over this systemic type of perpetration, this systemic type of aggression towards the children, towards their rights, towards the women. The list goes on and on.
Sometimes people don't make one killer. It's just about
Absolutely, absolutely. People are many times giving a narrative, and this is how they would in this society. It's all about presenting things in a narrative and not necessarily looking at the implication of it. Presenting it in a narrative where it's about love, it's about being tolerant towards others' feelings, it's about giving people the spaces to do what they are comfortable with, which is liberalism, etc. Then without us recognizing, we're just trying to bring in a narrative and not necessarily look at the implications that these narratives have actually caused all those injustices. All right, we are actually going to continue with, inshallah, Surah Al Imran. And the good news, we are actually at the last page. So we'll be answering some questions, inshallah. Let's continue. We were doing the part. So there are some people that are co-hosts. So for those co-hosts, please, if you can help me admit people. So Samira, you're a co-host, and many other people. In fact, most of you are. So just admit people. All right, so let's look at the previous ayat right there. رَبَّنَا وَآتِنَا مَا وَعَدتَّنَا عَلَى رُسُلِكَ. Now, one thing I would like to say is that what you see right here, مَا وَعَدتَّنَا, you might wonder why the dal is actually gray. All right, well, that's because the letter dal and the letter ta, they actually come from the same place of articulation, which is the tip of the tongue. So we don't read it wa'adatana, but we read it as wa'atana. In other words, we assimilate between the letter da and the letter ta. Wa'atana, in taking out the letter da and simply stressing on the letter ta. Ma wa'atana ala rusulik. So we could see that the ending, and this is very common in the different surahs. Some surahs would end with, give it, something similar to a conclusion. And a lot of the conclusions, they may end with dua, just like in Surah Al-Fatiha, all right? اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم would end with dua. Other surahs may end with a concluding statement to connect with what was in the beginning, what was the beginning on the starting point of the surah. So it would basically say, well, this is what we're starting out with. Here's how I would want to conclude, by connecting the beginning and the end together to make it a coherent statement. Some surahs would end with a glory to the Lord Almighty. You would see certain surahs connected, ending with an announcement. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين, as an ending clause or an ending statement within those surahs. So with this surah, on the other hand, you could say that it was ending in a number of series of du'as. It's important to mention that this du'a is actually a sunnah. The last 10 ayat of Surah Al Imran, it is a sunnah to end it and read it every night that you actually before your sleep. So that is a sunnah to read those 10 ayat. And there were numerous ahadith, and many of them were actually authentic in speaking about the importance of these last 10 ayat of Surah Al Imran. So we could see the ayat Rabbana, Rabbana, and of course, Rabbana actually means our Lord, but that's a form of an invocation. It's a form of an invocation saying, "Oh Lord," and bring in the request. You could see, so here we go, the request, although it's not here. If you start looking at Rabbana, innana sami'na munadiya yunadi lil iman. That wasn't a dua actually. So it was a prelude for the dua. All right. And this is important. So whenever you make a dua, you can start out with a prelude to kind of give like an introductory to get you into the, let's call it connection, the spiritual connection between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, recognizing the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and recognizing at that moment how your submission to the Lord Almighty is. Which is why you could see same thing with Surah Al-Fatiha. You look at Surah Al-Fatiha, the prelude is Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. That was the start. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. All the praises due to the Lord Almighty. It's still Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, Maliki Yawmiddin. The prelude in a dua would usually contain as an emphasis where it not an emphasis on the Lord Almighty's magnificence. That's number one. Number two, which is really important to mention because it emphasizes not only on the Lord Almighty's magnificence, but also your position as a servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, you're emphasizing al-ubudiyya lillah. What is al-ubudiyya lillah? Al-ubudiyya lillah simply means that you are at that moment taking a religious conviction to recognize, acknowledge the power of the Lord Almighty and even your own, and even your own servitude to the Lord Almighty. So you could see that numerous ayat before the dua. That's the same thing. Innana sami'na munadiya yunadi lil iman. Oh Lord Almighty, we had heard. And of course, when you say oh Rabbana, it's basically bringing in where you are recognizing a personal conversation between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Oh Rabbana, oh Lord, Rabbana. So why the na? This letter na right there, like ihdina. What is the na? Na is actually a we. We to mean a plural form. Why a plural form? Because it's a form of one, being humble. You're recognizing that humility in where you recognize that it's not just you alone, but you are part of a congregation with those that you would want to connect with in terms of the believers, in terms of those that were embracing the faith, etc. And therefore, you're taking a moment to bring in a religious conviction with the Lord Almighty spiritually, and you're also connecting with those others that are holding on to the faith. So it's kind of like a congregation. Rabbana, we had heard, and you could see innana, we. Why not I? Why doesn't it sound better if I were to say I had heard?
No, we is better.
We is better. How is it better? So here's the thing. In the ayat, the word we is in, because in Lugha Arabiya, that when you say we had gathered, just in order to bring in one. So in Lugha Arabiya, it's kind of different than in English, because in English, it's more of when you're actually saying I, it's such and such. In English, it shows you a person being humble. But in Arabic, It actually shows that when you're actually saying we, it actually is to present that I am being humble. I'm amongst this crowd. All of this crowd is gathering for your highness, is gathering for your magnificence in order to reveal, to announce their own servitude to your magnificence, O Lord Almighty. Sami'na, we had heard a person, munadiya. What is munadiya yunadi? Il munadi is a person that is calling on to something, but this is not talking about a person just calling, but this is, in other words, a person inviting people to worship the Lord Almighty. Today I was actually having a conversation with someone, and it's really important to mention this point. Um, there is a common question that people would ask: isn't it better that we would actually speak in political correctness than actually speak the ultimate and the obvious truth and let's call it uh, the listening ear from a lot of the youth? Now, here's one thing. This is a very important issue to talk about. Why? Because the second that we use the political correctness, we carry within it our own self contradiction. Because the second that you use political correctness, by definition, what you're actually saying is that you are giving hierarchy, superiority to whatever you are trying to appeal to. All right? You're giving that priority, that hierarchy to whatever you're appealing to. And then in that moment, you're contradicting yourself by simply considering that, oh, Islam also says this. And the same second that you're saying Islam is also saying that, you are containing within your words self-contradiction in where you're saying Islam is superior, but at the same time using the political correctness in order to sound appealing by bringing in some form of an appealing rhetoric that contains some form of wording that's saying, well, we are the same as that. What is political correctness? Well, political correctness is simply trying to appeal to the masses using some form of hypocrisy, some form of rhetoric to sound as if it is acceptable, to repackage, let's say it that way, Islam or the truth to make it seem appealing by changing the interpretation in order to let the masses take some of these words at least as acceptable to them. All the prophets and all the messengers did not use political correctness or sound appealing in order to gain publicity or gain the masses. They said it straightforward. La ilaha illallah. No political correctness. Straightforward. If only Muhammad, if only you would accept our gods, or at least somehow we can negotiate how we can be tolerant over one another, but we won't accept that you would call on to La ilaha illallah. Did the Prophet ﷺ give it up? He would have probably gained more voices than an opposition if he were to somehow negotiate or put a middle line or accept or embrace a middle line between him and the pagan Arab. After all, he was considered a main figure that was, to a certain extent, accepted by a large majority of people. But it isn't until he was really committed to La ilaha illallah did he get the opposition. You will get the opposition for sure if you stay firm on whatever words that you are calling for in Islam. But your duty is not to gain publicity. Your duty is one thing. وَمَا عَلَى الرَّسُولِ إِلَّا الْبَلَاغُ. The only mission that a prophet is supposed to be doing is delivering the message. That's all you have to do. Don't worry about how appealing it is. Don't worry about how many people follow the truth, because even with Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, what did he say? فقلت استغفروا ربكم إنه كان غفارا يرسل السماء عليكم مدرارا ويمددكم بأموال وبنين ويجعل لكم جنات ويجعل لكم أنهارا ما لكم لا ترجون لله وقارا وقد خلقكم أطوارا. What did they do? استغشوا ثيابهم أصروا واستكبروا استكبارا. What else? جعلوا أصابعهم في آذانهم واستغشوا ثيابهم وأصروا واستكبروا استكبارا. This is what they did. They're still going to reject it. Your responsibility is not to gain publicity. Your responsibility is to deliver the truth, whether it was appealing or not. But there's no way that you will be capable of delivering the message when you, as a Muslim, are somehow removing the izzah of your Islam. Al-izzah is an integral khuluq, is an integral morality in Islam. It's an integral morality. It is actually within it because it is one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Al-izzah lillah wa li rasulihi wa lil mu'mineen. There's no way that you can be Muslim empty of izzah. There's no way. If you're empty of izzah, there's no way that you can maintain your Islam. Why? Because part of the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, part of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically Al-Aziz. Al-Aziz. If you don't have izzah, there's no way that you could actually stand up to be part of those that carry the legacy of the prophets and the messengers. Carrying the legacy of the prophets and the messengers comes with La ilaha illallah, comes with Allahu Akbar. There's no way. That's what it comes with. It comes with Allahu Akbar. That's why the most dhikr that a mu'min does is Allahu Akbar. Why? Because there's no way. It's telling you, I want you to get the izzah. Don't weaken. You can't be humiliated. Don't just embrace rhetoric just because everybody else is saying it. لله العزة ورسوله وللمؤمنين. Now that's the same thing when we're actually talking about the ending of these ayat. ربنا إننا سمعنا مناديا ينادي للإيمان. Ya Allah, we had heard someone call on to yunadiyan. Munadiyan, yunadi. What is it, yunadi? Yunadi, calling out. Come and join in iman. Come and join faith. Be part of the faithful. And aminu bi rabbikum. What was the call? Believe in your Lord Almighty. What does that actually entail? Believing in the Lord Almighty entails that you would denounce every other superior being, anything superior or anything beyond Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether we're talking about in deity or whether we're talking about in worship or whether we're talking about in legislature. This is what it means. Munadiya yunadi lil iman. Lil iman, believing in the deity itself, Allah Almighty. 2, worshiping only Allah Almighty. And 3, considering the Lord Almighty as the one to define truth, to define justice, to define haqq, to define what a man is, what a woman is, what their role is, where and what is haram and halal transaction, what is good economy, what is bad economy, all of that. Not until then will the ummah regain its tawheed. Our problem is that we actually lost our understanding and our definition of tawheed. Once tawheed is not in place, you're going to find paganism with what? With somebody that is basically dressed in hijab. Hijab doesn't make tawheed unless there's la ilaha illallah on the inside. That's when you will have it. A nun wears hijab. And believe me, you've got some nuns and some Jewish women even dress better than a lot of Muslim women. You see how you dress, Ayan, with the black and all covered up? We have Jewish women in Palestine dressed like that. This is real. Jewish women dressed like that. Yeah. You don't have to go. I haven't actually seen Hasidic Jews in St. Louis Park. Long skirts. No, I'm talking about covered in black, just like Saudi. In Palestine, you will have dressed in black, just like Saudi, all covered up, exactly the way that you would see in Saudi Arabia, all covered up, nothing appearing. Israeli Jewish women. And it's so sad that we're seeing how Muslim women are trying and thinking that by giving up on their hijab, by reducing their level of hijab, that they're going to be appealing. They're going to seem tolerant. Why are you giving up on your hijab? Don't give up on your hijab. وَلَن تَرْضَ عَنْكَ الْيَهُودُ وَلَا النَّصَارَى حَتَّى تَتَّبِعَ مِلَّتَهُم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you they'll never accept you. Not the Jews and not the Christians will never accept you حَتَّى تَتَّبِعَ مِلَّتَهُم, until you embrace their faith. We have to recognize that. So what should I do? Well, continue with La ilaha illallah. So what do? فآمنا يا Allah, we had embraced faith. ربنا فاغفر لنا ذنوبنا وكفر عنا سيئاتنا وتوفنا مع الأبرار. Ya Allah, so forgive our sins and remove or wipe away all our transgressions. And we talked about the difference between dhanb and the sayyi'ah. وتوفنا مع الأبرار. وتوفنا. التوفنا is different than amitna. So tawaffana, when a person is alive, basically, Ya Allah, make us from those that will die with al-abrar. What? A massive graveyard? And no, this is not what it's talking about. In other words, Ya Allah, include us amongst al-abrar. Include us. So we're not actually asking to die altogether in some kind of a massive massacre or a massive death toll, somehow an earthquake putting all the people in the masjid together. No, this is not talking about this. وَتَوَفَّنَا مَعَ الْأَبْرَارِ. This is making the dua. Ya Allah, when I die, include me with those that are al-abrar. طب البر, who's al-bar? Al-bar is the highest level of al-mu'min. Who is that? Al-bar is the person that is consistent with their piety. They don't have relapses. They're consistent with piety. They're consistent with their servitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're consistent with their submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're consistent with their connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's al-bar. And especially with their akhlaq. Al-abrar are focused on their akhlaq. رَبَّنَا وَآتِنَا مَا وَعَدْتَنَا عَلَى رُسُلِكَ. O Lord Almighty, yes.
Sayyi'at is the effect of sin.
Sayyi'at is so if dhanb is the effect of sin, if sayyi'ah is basically the sin itself. Sayyi'ah is the transgression itself. If then is the effect that comes with it. So you would think of it as a tail. You would commit a transgression and it keeps following you, just like a tail. That's why dhanab. What is it, dhanab? Dhanab is the tail. Wherever it goes, basically, drags, it comes with them. All right? Comes with them. It's connected. All right? So think of that. So think of it that way. Now, when you say فَغْفِرْ لَنَا, al-ghufran is basically asking for it to be forgiven. In other words, the implication of the sin because that we're talking about dhunubana. So the implication of the sin that has been dragging me, okay, that it would be wiped away. But then كفر عنا سيئاتنا. التكفير here is basically to wipe away. All right, to wipe away, to take away all the السيئة. What is a sayyi'ah? A sayyi'ah is any transgression. A sin that you commit is a sayyi'ah. But even though a sayyi'ah is really the dhanb, it's really talking about the same thing. All right? It's talking about the same thing. It's a transgression. But in the word then, it's coming to explain the transgression from the point in where it drags you behind. But a sayyi'ah is basically discussing it from the point of in itself is basically stopping you from you moving forward. It's a transgression. You see it? You see it? One is dragging you behind, the then is dragging you behind. It's basically causing you to regress in your life. All right. And a sayyi'ah is like it's stopping you from moving forward. It's the same thing, really. It's the same thing, but it's just trying to help us recognize the implications of different sins and how one type of implication is that it may actually make you regress in life, and another type of implication in where it would actually stop you from improving, from getting ahead and farther within your life. So you're saying, كفر عنا, in other words, take it away in order for me to move forward. And that's important. That's important because many times we don't recognize how sins have an impact on ourselves, have an impact on probably us getting successes, whether we're talking about a success in probably in our education, maybe our social relations, maybe our economical situation, maybe our even psychological, our mental health. السيئة has an implication even on your mental health. It basically drags you onto earth. How do you actually get into that type of elevation? How do you get yourself into a kind of healing from the different regressions? Part of it that is rarely talked about is how sin can actually impact our own mental health and our spirituality, because it's a price, which is why one reason why mental health is escalating is really part of it, is really right there. It's the dhanb that's keeping us behind, and it's the sayyi'ah that's blocking us from advancing. And it becomes the sayyi'ah. It becomes the sin. Why? Because we recognize as human beings certain transgressions, but not everything we always recognize. Many times we can commit a sin and not recognize that we had actually done or said something. What's the evidence on that? Well, remember how Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam, as an example, all right, when he made when he had swore by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he would actually have 99 women. He was married to 99 women, that he would go around and actually get them all pregnant in order to get more soldiers, but then he only got one simply because he didn't say inshallah. That was Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam. All right. So exactly. The Christians and the Jews, they actually have 700 wives for Prophet Sulaiman. The Muslims actually have 99. All right. So we're a little less polygamous than they are.
So he had only one child.
He only had one child. Because, and the Prophet said because he didn't say inshallah.
It's just Dawood.
That was Sulaiman.
Sulaiman had one.
So was it Dawood or Sulaiman? I think it was Dawood. I think you're right. I think it's Dawood.
I just know one is the father.
Well, Dawood is the father, Sulaiman is the son. Sulaiman is the son, Dawood is the father. ربنا وآتنا ما وعدتنا على رسلك ولا تخزنا يوم القيامة ولا تخزنا يوم القيامة إنك لا تخلف الميعاد. O Lord Almighty, give us what you had promised us on your prophets or to your prophets. Was it to or on? وعدتنا على رسلك, not وعدتنا برسلك. Why? So what you had promised us through, that is, your prophets and messengers. Through your prophets and messengers. So does that contradict our own sincerity? Does it contradict our sincerity if what we're really seeking is Jannah? It doesn't. Because you recognize that your road to Jannah is by actually seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be content over you. So wanting Jannah is not in any way a form of denouncing or at least turning away from sincerity. It's actually part of it. And when you're sincere in one, in wanting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be content over you. Two, also sincere in your request for Jannah too. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us and you. وَلَا تُخْزِنَا يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ. And don't humiliate us on يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ. What is يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ? يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ is the day of standing. Why day of standing? More people have chairs and no, people won't be sitting down. People will all be standing. 50,000 years, 100,000 years. The standing, the day where everyone will be standing, of course, waiting for Judgment Day is basically a day, not only the disbelievers will be afraid on that day, but even the believers, as a matter of fact, even the prophets and the messengers will be afraid. Even the prophets and the messengers will actually be afraid on that day. So there are certain moments on Judgment Day, whether you're a believer or not a believer, you will still be afraid. Even if you're a prophet. Why? Because of hawl al-mawqif. What is hawl al-mawqif? Because of the fear, because of the stance on that day. So what do you say? وَلَا تُخْزِنَا. And don't humiliate us. Right here. وَلَا تُخْزِنَا يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ إِنَّكَ لَا تُخْلِفُ الْمِيعَادَ. And don't humiliate us on that day. So what does إِنَّكَ لَا تُخْلِفُ الْمِيعَادَ have to do with this? Because you're recognizing that there is an appointed day, which is Judgment Day, that there is no alternate answer or an alternate thing, that one day maybe Allah will decide that He doesn't want to make Judgment Day. It's final. That's why إِنَّكَ لَا تُخْلِفُ الْمِيعَادَ. It's final. There is no way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will actually change the day of Yawm al-Qiyamah or change the whole idea that there is Yawm al-Qiyamah. There are certain things that are mustahila on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Many times people will say there's nothing impossible on Allah. Yes, there is. Yes, there is something impossible on Allah. How is it? I thought Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala kulli shay'in qadir. But there are certain things that are impossible. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is it possible that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can have a child? No, why not? Because He's the creator. It's impossible for Allah to have a creator. To have a child. Why? Because the second that He's a creature, He's not a creator anymore. And in that situation, there are certain things that are impossible on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to actually say, well, yeah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ala kulli shay'in qadir, then therefore He could have a son. No, that's impossible on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's no way that because by definition, you cannot have contradictions like that. He is the creator, therefore not a creature. It's exactly like saying, well, can I have a squared triangle? There's no way that you can't have it. By the second that it becomes a triangle, it's not a square anymore. What I could say. Or by the second that you basically make the triangle become a square, or the square become a triangle, basically just ceases to be what it is.
Rectangle.
Exactly. Or a rectangle, whatever it is. It ceases to be what it is. So that's why it's impossible to say, well, can I have a squared circle? There's no way. It ceases to be a square once you make it into a circle. That's the same thing. God will cease to be a God the second that he becomes a creature. Because by definition, a God is simply the one that created. A God is simply the one that is beyond creation. Because the second that he is part of the creation, he actually becomes a creature that requires a creator. And that's impossible in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So a lot of times, even Muslims will confuse that and say, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ala kulli shay'in qadir, therefore, ala kulli shay'. And it's possible that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can do even the impossible. You know, there are certain things that are impossible, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to actually say that, is it possible? He's ala kulli shay'in qadir. Is it possible that he can decide that he doesn't want a judgment day to come anymore? That's absolutely impossible. Because because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, إِنَّكَ لَا تُخْلِفُ الْمِيعَادِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not alternate the promises that he had actually made. He won't change his mind about it. He said that he's not going to change it. So there's no way. This is an impossible thing because the Lord Almighty, when he decrees a matter, we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not change his decree. فاستجاب لهم ربهم يا الله أني لا أضيع عمل عامل منكم من ذكر أو أنثى. What is فاستجاب? فاستجاب means, and this is important because it didn't say ثم استجاب. What's the difference between if it were to say ثم استجاب or فاستجاب or واستجاب? Exactly. ثم is basically called مع التراخي. What is التراخي? التراخي, if you were to say ثم, means there was a time lapse. Later, there was a response because the word فاستجاب means that the dua was answered. Right? ثم استجاب means there was a time lapse when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answered their prayer. But فاستجاب, it was an immediate thing that the Lord Almighty had answered their invocation. واستجاب actually means that there was a longer time lapse, and it can mean an addition. واستجاب can mean an addition. It could also mean that there was a long time lapse. So فاستجاب simply means that the Lord Almighty had immediately answered their dua. فاستجاب لهم ربهم. استجاب لهم, the Lord Almighty had answered them. Where is the مفعول به here? دعوتهم, دعاءهم. What is the مفعول به? In other words, where's the object here? He answered what? Well, he answered this dua that they had made, which was mentioned previously. That was what they were, what their invocation was. That was what the Lord Almighty had accepted. That was what the Lord Almighty indeed answered for them. Now, here's one thing. In istijaba actually means to give a note to something. Il-jawab, the answer, a report to something, a response. A response to something when we say istajaba or ajaba. Ajaba, I would say, did you put the dark chocolate on this carpet? She responds, I did. Did you buy it? I did. That was the response. The response can be a response to a question, and can be an informative response. All right, a response to a question. So it can be that I put the chocolate here after me asking or inquiring who put the chocolate here. فاستجاب. Sometimes it doesn't have to be based on a dua. It can be that the Lord Almighty had known your situation and the Lord Almighty had responded to your situation and actually responded in your request that you did not necessarily speak of. Yet, is it the adab to not say it and say, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam bihali. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows my situation, therefore I'm not going to say anything. No. The adab is to live the servitude to the Lord Almighty and actually make the dua. Can I make the dua speaking my situation, even though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows the situation? Things like, Ya Allah, I'm going through this struggle. Ya Allah, I lost this. I wanted this. Ya Allah, help me find this. It is actually something that you could see the ayat themselves. رَبَّنَا إِنَّنَا سَمِعْنَا مُنَادِيًا يُنَادِي لِلْإِيمَانِ. Ya Allah, we heard somebody calling on to faith and we answered the faith. It's not like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows why you're a Muslim or he doesn't know why you're a Muslim. But that's for you to hear it, for you to vocalize it, for you to embrace it, for you to speak it. In other words, for you to take as a moment of confession to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So here, فَاسْتَجَابَ لَهُمْ رَبُّهُمْ أَنِّي لَا أُضِيعُ عَمَلَ عَامِلٍ مِّنْكُمْ مِنْ ذَكَرٍ أَوْ أُنْثَى. Their Lord Almighty responded to their dua that I would not أُضِيع, the word أُضِيع, where I would not lose or I would not disregard the action of anybody that does any action from amongst you. Now I want you to look at the word minkum, because the word minkum is in response to all the calls and where we're saying, Ya Allah, we are this. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, well, all of you, whoever's part of this dua, you will be included in this. And I'm talking to all of you here, min dhakarin aw untha, whether that was a female or whether that was a male that had put in any contribution of a good deed. Ba'dukum min ba'd. I want you to focus on that one. Ba'dukum min ba'd. What is ba'dukum min ba'd? Well, that's because it is very common, even during the time of the pagan Arab timing, where they had regarded, and this is important to mention, that they had regarded that manhood or masculinity is somehow superior. And because they regarded it superior, that main idea had actually many implications on them, where they had given themselves the justification to do a lot of crimes against the women, because they considered that it is a probable thing that this woman might probably bring a disgrace to the family. So they basically started committing infanticide and burying the girls while they're alive. In fact, it was very common. This one is probably the most thing that I cannot fathom. Can you imagine that when they were having their babies, so the woman is basically getting a baby, she's going through labor and the pain and all of that, but then they would have a hole or a ditch right underneath her. If it's a girl, just bury her right away. Imagine. Right underneath, she's going through all the screaming and no epidural. All right, no epidural, no painkillers, no Percocet, no nothing to take away the pain, no oxycodone, no none of that. And what are you doing? Right the second she gets the baby girl, the ditch is right there open. Put it over her right away and just cover it. That's it. We're done. Beat all of them. Well, this is the society. This is the society. There are certain things that people don't recognize. Well, isn't that already practiced right there? You've got just less than 0.1 miles right there. There's the abortion center right there, right across the street from Aldi. They call it Planned Parenthood. Yeah, that area, yeah, they call it Planned Parenthood to give it a different name. Yeah, the Planned Parenthood is basically in an abortion center and all of that. This is what it is right there. This is where they kill babies.
You just said the same, but you don't know.
Yeah, this is where it is, right across the street from Aldi. That there you got Planned Parenthood in order to kill babies right there. Oh, they'll see them. They can be born and they'll probably even snatch one ligament and one body organ one at a time while they're in their baby's wombs and just start snatching them from their mom's wombs right there. Then they'll consider that, oh, probably doesn't even have any feelings right there. Or even the babies are born and when they're born, they're moving, they're struggling, grasping for air, but then those supposedly doctors and nurses, they're just letting them, it's like, okay, yeah, you're just gonna die. Yeah. How is that different than infanticide? Right now, it's done by doctors even. It's done by doctors, by nurses, by professionals. Just because they're wearing suits and just because they have a degree, it doesn't make them less of criminals. In fact, a lot of the worst criminals are actually dressed in suits. If you think the criminals are the ones that you see on the street, you got it wrong. Got a lot of those criminals are actually killing thousands and millions of people. They're dressed in beautiful suits. They're called politicians, baby. They're called politicians when in reality, they're nothing but gangsters dressed in suits. That's what they are. Gangsters dressed in suits. They look like these suits and where they look professional, but the reality is these people are basically committing massacres and massacres. Just because they're dressed in beautiful suits doesn't make them less criminals. That's the reality. Yeah, you had a lot of mass killers and serial killers that were actually just enjoying dropping bombs. It's so strange. Madeleine Albright. You don't know who Madeleine Albright is? How old are you? 30. No, really? Okay. Madeleine Albright. That woman is evil, man. So this is real. When during the war on Iraq, okay. So that at the time she was, I think she was the person that was basically responsible for the international relations and the spokesperson, Department of State, and all of that. Secretary of State, that's what she was called. Okay. And when she was asked whether dropping the bombs on the Iraqis, and because there were a million people that were already lost because of the war, whether it was worth it. Worth what? Well, worth the oil. She basically said it was worth it. A million people getting killed. And she said, yeah, it's worth it. A million people, yeah, it's worth it. Yeah, that's all right. I mean, we've got good oil coming out of it. That doesn't matter. Anyways, they're Arab, so big deal.
She has to face that. It's going to be a rough day for her.
A rough day for her. Well, yeah. And it's not just Madeleine Albright. I mean, you look at a lot of politicians and where they're doing exactly the same thing, and we're talking about millions of people are really just responsible.
Millions of people have to say.
Allah al-Musta'an.
Yeah, I would not be present before that. It was dunya.
Ya Allah, one of the saddest words that always it just brings into my ears. it was a young child, a young Syrian child. Um, he was, I think, coming out of the rebels, and he was like, I told Allah about this. I was telling him that what you guys are doing. It's like, oh, that is so scary. It's like, I told Allah about this. That is so scary to hear. It's like, I told Allah, I'm finished. I told Allah. Look at the faith. It's like, I told Allah about this. Ya Allah, Ya Allah. أني لا أضيع عمل عامل منكم من ذكر أو أنثى بعضكم من بعض. بعضكم من بعض. In other words, women and men, they actually come from the same, from the same, uh, from the same place of creation too, that they're actually part of one another. In other words, no one is actually superior or inferior. Now that's really important to mention. And it's really sad how a lot of times they will actually, even scholars will go into a debate which is better and which is superior, hamkumullah, whether it's male or female. I find that debate really rather strange, and definitely a debate that is I don't mean by funny as something that is to be laughed about, but what I mean by funny is ironic. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, بعضكم من بعض. فَالَّذِينَ هَاجَرُوا. As for those. Now, when you look at this fa, this is different than this fa. Because this fa is talking about immediate response, but this فَالَّذِينَ هَاجَرُوا, this is basically giving you, so you would want to hear, actually put a semicolon. So as for, in other words, this fa means as for. Now it's giving me a category. Okay, now it's giving me a category. Now it's explaining to me in different categories of what's going to happen. فَالَّذِينَ هَاجَرُوا وَأُخْرِجُوا. So for those that had migrated, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَالَّذِينَ هَاجَرُوا وَأُخْرِجُوا. So for those that had migrated from where? From Mecca to Medina. So can there be a different kind of hijrah? Is this talking about people leaving Mecca to Medina right now? No. لا هجرة بعد الفتح. There's no hijrah after Fath Mecca, after the conquering of Mecca. When was that? That was the 8th year hijrah. So after the 8th year hijrah, there was no later muhajirin. That was the end of all the immigrants that had migrated to Medina. Before the date of 8th year hijrah, migration to Medina was obligatory upon every Muslim. All right? Was obligatory. That's why you had Abu Musa al-Ash'ari migrate. You had, well, Ja'far ibn Abi Talib was actually at Abyssinia at the time, so that they also had migrated. You had Abu Dhar al-Ghafari migrated. You had all the Muslimin that were basically in Mecca. Well, not all of them, because some of them couldn't make it, because some were elderly, some were women, some were not capable of migrating. But for those that did manage to migrate for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to exclude those that had migrated for the sake of dunya. Like who? Muhajir Qais. What about Muhajir Qais? Muhajir Qais was Muslim, but he had migrated to Medina because he was in love with a woman. Her name was Qais. So he basically went to Medina because he wanted to get married to Qais. So they went to the Prophet ﷺ and said, well, does Muhajir Qais actually get the same reward? And the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. All the matters are dependent upon the intention that was delivered for. What provoked that intention is really going to determine whether that person is going to be granted the reward or not. And that's why the hadith, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ وإنما لكل امرئ ما نوى فمن كانت هجرته إلى الله ورسوله فهجرته إلى الله ورسوله. ومن كانت هجرته لدنيا يصيبها أو امرأة ينكحها, insinuating on Muhajir and Qais. So whoever has been traveling or migrating for a matter in dunya that they wanted to get the advantage for or the advantage to, and in that situation, this is basically what they're going to be, in other words, taking the advantage of. But for those that migrated for dunya يصيب امرأة ينكحها, or a woman to get married to, فهجرته إلى ما هاجر إليه. And well, what they were actually traveling for is exactly the privilege that they will be getting. That's it. The wife, exactly. He wanted to get married. Well, there you go. وأخرجوا من ديارهم. أخرجوا, they were expelled of their cities. When you look at أخرجوا من ديارهم وأوذوا في سبيلي, أخرجوا من ديارهم, they were expelled out of their city. Why? Because there are a number of different things why you would be expelled out of your city. And that's a very hard thing to do. To leave a country that you had built a home in, you have a job, you have all your maintenance that you worked so hard to build in that country. It takes a lot of guts. A lot of guts.
Taking all my appliances with me.
You know,
my espresso machine, like
there you go. The most important thing, coffee machine, right?
it's
Subhanallah, it's not easy to actually leave everything and decide it's time for me to migrate, especially if you're migrating to a place you might not be familiar with the weather, with the people, with the culture, with the language, with the jobs. It's a totally different thing. Even the Sahaba, when they migrated to Medina, you might think, oh, it's not like they had an espresso machine to take care of. No, they actually all got sick in Medina because it was a totally different weather. And they all had a terrible flu. I don't know if it was COVID. Okay. They had a terrible flu. And that's why they were all just like, they were all sick. They had a severe fever in Medina. Why? Because the climate in Medina is colder than the climate in Mecca. And these people were not used to this. They were used to a very dry, harsh climate in Mecca. So once they go to a climate that was more humid, a climate that was a little bit colder. When you're talking about more humid, well, it depends on, humidity, and it depends on the breeze, whether it becomes colder or whether it becomes, let's say, more sweaty. But at the end of the day is that they all got the flu and they all got sick. And the sickness wasn't for a small time, by the way. It did actually take some time to actually stay within that sickness, which is why when you see that ayah, when it talks about فَالَّذِينَ هَاجَرُوا وَأُخْرِجُوا مِنْ دِيَارِهِمْ, emphasizing that they had actually left and they put a lot of commitment to leave from that type of society, from where they had built their homes, where they had built their own livelihood, and all of a sudden they had to leave everything in order to start a new start. That's why it continues. وَأُوذُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَأُوذُوا فِي سَبِيلِ. So what is وَأُوذُوا فِي سَبِيلِ? In other words, this is explaining more details to what was actually coming from leaving the city. أُخْرِجُوا مِنْ دِيَارِهِمْ. They were expelled out of their city. And not only that, أُوذُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. The أُوذُوا فِي سَبِيلِ. They were harmed for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How were they harmed? The unemployment rate amongst the Muslims went up. They couldn't find jobs. You had some Sahaba that even migrated to Medina. They were businessmen. All of a sudden, they're in a city that was based on agriculture. Totally a new system. Now they had to learn new skills. Now they had to leave everything behind. It was a totally new system. أُذُوا في سبيلي, financially harmed, socially harmed, even their shelter, and the list goes on and on, unemployment, etc. It was all just for the sake of Islam. You gave up your house. You gave up on your job that was looking very successful. You gave up on everything that you had because you wanted dunya. There is no way that you could actually have dunya and akhirah at the same time. You need to do a trade-off. The trade-off was you need to give up on your dunya to seek akhirah. You need to give up on your dunya to seek akhirah. Even if I get less privileges, even if you get less privileges, because this is what udu fi sabili is, you're getting less privileges. You're getting less privileges. You might actually be getting a better privilege by probably going to a public school or probably attending these, these universities of high class universities. You might actually get better advantages. Indeed. But because you're worried about your akhirah, you might choose to take a less privileged opportunity. You might choose to take it, even though you do have a better offer, but you turn it down because you want your akhirah. She turned down an offer to probably study at Pennsylvania University or study at Harvard because her family wouldn't actually go with her. She turned it down. You leave something for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will compensate you something more important, something better. It's all about leaving and deciding to take the akhirah. وَقَاتَلُوا وَقُتِلُوا لَأُكَفِّرَنَّ عَنْهُمْ سَيِّئَاتِهِمْ. وَقَاتَلُوا. Now this is taking us into a different step where they actually had fought. Now here's one thing, is that the word قَاتَلُوا, القتال does not always involve. So in English, if I were to actually interpret the word قَاتَلَ or قَتَلَ, we're going to use the word fight. But this is not necessarily always relating to killing or fighting or some form of violence. Because المقاتلة does not always in Lugha Arabiya involve violence. It can actually involve overcoming a challenge. Overcoming a challenge. So here, قاتلوا could mean that they were overcoming a challenge, whether that challenge was military, political, social, all the different challenges. They basically had struggled, had done all the effort that they could do in order to overcome the challenge. وَقُتِلُوا, and here, this one could only mean one thing. قُتِلُوا could only mean one thing, which is that they were actually killed. It could only mean one thing. It can't mean that they were put in a challenge. No, قُتِلُوا only means one thing. They were actually killed for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What does that mean? They were killed because they had become Muslim. They were killed for the choices that they had made of wanting to be Muslim. Sumayya. Yes, and many others. لَأُكَفِّرَنَّ عَنْهُمْ سَيِّئَاتِهِمْ. Now the word لَأُكَفِّرَنَّ, لَأُقَتِّلَنَّ, لَأُقَطِّعَنَّ, لَآكُلَنَّ, okay? لَأَشْرَبَنَّ. The verb, when it has the lam in the beginning and the noon that has a shadda at the end, is the strongest way of putting an emphasis, and it's a form of an oath. It's a form of an oath, making it an emphasized verb. I will for sure do. So whether it's, if I were to say لَآكُلَنَّ, I will for sure eat. So why did I say for sure? I will for sure. It's because the noon that has a shadda right there. So لَأُكَفِّرَنَّ, I will wipe away all their sins. But here's one thing. It didn't say لَأُكَفِّرَنَّ سَيِّئَاتِهِمْ. عنهم سيئاتهم. What is عنهم? العن is supposed to be a form of upon. Upon. When something is upon something. So when you say on something, you're basically upon, whether we're talking about a transmission or whether we're saying that something is like a burden over a person. So here, لأكفرن عنهم سيئاتهم, in order to give, and this is a metaphor right there. So when you say عنهم سيئاتهم, in where the sayyi'ah has been becoming a burden on top of them, and this burden, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had uplifted that burden off their backs. Yes, and had uplifted the burden off their backs. وَلَا أُدْخِلَنَّهُم. Same thing right there. Look at that. أُكَفِّرَنَّ لَأُدْخِلَنَّ. All right. What is that? That was exactly. It's giving me two things. It's giving me an oath, and it's also giving me an emphasis. It's giving me an emphasis, giving me an oath. It's basically telling me that there is a determination right there. لَأُدْخِلَنَّهُم. And I will for sure put them inside. أُدْخِلَنَّهُم. It's like dukhul. What is it, dukhul? Dukhul is really a penetration. But this is not talking about penetrating and where, this is just a different, some form of penetration, but this is actually saying, no, we're going to get them all the way inside. Going to get them all the way inside where? Jannah. لَأُدْخِلَنَّهُمْ. Ya Allah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promise all of us. Jannatin tajri. Jannat. What is it, Jannah? Jannah is basically a garden. But Jannat, gardens. What was that?
Whoever gets there first, remembers the rest.
Jannatin, there you go. Jannatin tajri min tahtiha al-anhar. Jannatin tajri min tahtiha al-anhar. So they're gardens where right beneath them there are rivers. I don't really know how that works.
Yeah, that's what we get there, right?
Exactly. I don't know how that works because if there is water flowing from beneath it, so what is it landing on?
Yeah.
Is it
And it's green.
I can understand that there would be a pool next to it, which I would really want, and also water flowing from underneath. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give all of us. I don't really know, I would really want somebody that is specialized in
What kind of story?
architecture to actually tell me how that works.
You in Jannah. Sit down in the class.
Exactly. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give it. Ya Allah, this is so, I am obsessed with looking at architecture. Maybe I should have actually studied architecture. I'm obsessed with looking at architecture.
I'm still that's sweet.
I love looking at architecture. How do these people think about the ideas, doing all the architecture, doing all of that? I just love it. I just love it. It's amazing. And if you actually look at the Quran, there was a lot of emphasis on architecture as well, in where one, you're looking at the Jannah and where it's describing tajri min tahtiha al-anhar or tajri tahtaha al-anhar, or when you're looking even how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described Saba, that it was a magnificent architecture, or talked about Ad, that they're actually, they had a lot of pillars and in their homes and how they built it and scraped it literally from mountains. There was a lot of emphasis in the Quran on whether in dunya or even in akhirah, in talking about the structure and the architecture of buildings. There's a lot of that, whether we're, like I said, talking about the pyramids, and they were or talking about how the قوم عاد, قوم ثمود, Saba, in Saba, the floor, or even Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam, how he was ordering them to build them the poles, ordering them to build a certain structure. There was a lot to say about structure and building structure. it's really rather interesting where you would see the Quran, you know, giving you hints, not necessarily all the details of what the structure looks like, but giving you certain hints that the structure was containing poles, that the structure was this. You would really not think that that's of any importance. You know, you would just think it's like, I just want to know what happened, how did they deny it, etc. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, no, no, I want you to imagine the architecture, because the architecture was also resembling power, civilization, science, their intellect, and how far it goes. Because when we actually look at structure of buildings, it really reveals mental capacity of how the person was capable of understanding physics. It requires a lot of math to get things in place and put the right amount of, well, let's say balancing pressures and balancing pressures from top to bottom or from side to side. You don't actually have those pressures well studied, you can have the whole thing collapse, just like when you look at Derna in Libya, how the whole thing actually collapsed, except you have very few homes that managed to stay solid, standing firm, and not get affected by those two dams that had fallen, and even by the massive rains that had drained over them. When you look at, for example, Japan, they would actually have these massive earthquakes on the Richter scale and not have these numbers of casualties. Well, because how good they built it, because of the great management that they had recognized the importance of architecture, and that no, we can't just because somebody had a bachelor's degree in this type of engineering that they could just go and design homes. They only anoint and literally choose only a couple people to be in that field because they recognize that it is as dangerous as neurosurgery.
Kentucky doesn't recognize.
Here in a neurosurgeon is basically the most paid and basically has the highest GPA because they recognize how intricate and how detailed and how dangerous this type of medicine is. They don't let you get into that field unless you're really the top doctors right there. You had really mastered it. You don't get into neurosurgery that easily. You don't get into it that easily. But then you can get with a lower GPA and easily into architecture, different types of engineering. Well, not in Japan. Why? Because they recognize that this actually means a more dangerous field, and the impact is more dangerous than neurosurgery. Neurosurgery affecting one person, but architecture, you're building buildings where it may actually have hundreds of people underneath that building. We need to make sure that everybody is safe. It's really interesting how this is emphasized in the Quran to reflect these people's intellect. And when we say intellect, we're actually talking about power. We're talking about mental power that is reflecting on physical power. How did they manage to make those architectures, those buildings, etc. It's really rather interesting how right now a lot of, let's call them evolutionists, they like to portray that man, the earliest man, that they were stone age, they were barbaric, they didn't know anything, when what the Quran actually portrays is something that is totally different. The Quran actually portrays that no, there were people that were extremely intelligent, that were having the capacities, better than the capacities. In fact, the ayah is really clear about it, to tell us. In fact, They were even stronger than you. The ayah was really clear in Surah Al-Ahqaf. In fact, they were even stronger than you physically, mentally. So why would you dare, the ayah says, why would you dare challenge your Lord Almighty when those that lived before you were even stronger than you?
Without kids and God.
Exactly. Let's continue. Ya Allah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us that. ثوابا من عند الله. ثوابا من عند الله. ثوابا, what is thawab? Thawab is supposed to be the reward for an act or any deed. That's a thawab. So thawab is supposed to be the reward that you would give for something. Okay. So thawaban min indillah. In other words, min indi is basically to say from. Al-ind is nearness. So min indillah is to emphasize that it's a reward that is given directly from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No one is working on behalf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No, he'll give it to you directly. It's going to be given to you right there for you especially. So in other words, it's a form of closeness. You know, it's exactly like, for example, if we were in a school, okay, and then who's going to give you the reward? Well, the head of the school, the principal, whatever it is, the president for the school is the one to actually say, well, we're giving, you know, we're going to give Zamzam or Fatmata, you know, this reward for doing excellent work in her school, whatever it is, even though the teacher might not, or the president might not actually know all the details of why you deserved to take this reward, but still, it's a form of showing appreciation or excellence when you actually take it from the principal than actually take it from your own teacher himself. So here, thawaban min indillah, it's like, no, you're taking it.
The head of people giving them.
Exactly. So it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving it to you directly. He's the one that's giving it to you directly. Wallahu indahu husnu thawab. And the Lord Almighty has the best husnu thawab. Il-husn is what is good, but that still doesn't really give it the real meaning. Husn thawab, it's like the best of the rewards. Thawab, the best of the rewards, the best of the responses, the best of what you could do. لا يغرنك تقلب الذين كفروا في البلاد. لا يغرنك. The ayah right now is actually shifting, by the way. Let's look into this shift. And this happens a lot in where it's shifting from one word to another, one topic. In English, this is, at least in grammar, this is not liked in English. In Arabic, it's a form of balagha. It's a form of balagha to mean that it's a form of showing a high level of rhetorical speech. Let me see the ayah so you could see what I'm talking about. The ayah was talking about Jannah and talking about all of that. Let's see the ayah. لا يغرنك تقلب الذين كفروا في البلاد. Don't be manipulated or infatuated or deluded by the taqallub. By the taqallub actually means to be in a situation and then to change into a different situation. So taqallabu alladhina kafaru, in where they might be victorious at one point, they might regress in their powers at one point, but you can see that their status is shifting. There's an alternate. There's an can you? Their status is actually alternating from time to time. Now, this is one thing in where الذين كفروا في البلاد, those that disbelieve, you might actually recognize and notice that their situation is alternating from being victorious to being in some form of regression to being this. In other words, if they're victorious, that means you're regressing too. If they're being victorious, means you're inferior. They're superior, you're inferior. If you're being superior, they're inferior, right? What is this talking about? This is talking about the status. Whether we're talking about political status, economical status, military status, there at the end, you could see that the situation is fluctuating in terms of powers. All right. So this is not talking about where the person is flipping, where they're walking the streets and flipping and doing somersaults. This is not what it's talking about. This is not talking about anybody doing somersaults, but this is actually speaking about, it's a metaphor. This metaphor is actually describing how their status is, how their situation is changing. In other words, how your status is also changing. You're right now feeling less privileged. The privilege is all to them. You see it? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا يغرنك. Don't let that fool you. Why? Because it oftentimes people would interpret a privilege or an advantage, whether we're talking about political advantage, military advantage, maybe technology, the list goes on and on. Usually people would interpret that as victory, and people would interpret that proves that they're actually on the track of success. The track of success. This is how, and especially the younger generation, they could easily get manipulated and think, well, look, they would go to Africa and see how the Muslims are struggling economically, politically, socially, all those different things that would have come with it. And they would feel, well, why do I want to be part of that failing society? They would come to a kafir society. Look, you enter the airport, air conditioned, well managed, even your rights, everything. You would start feeling, well, I don't want to be part of that society. Look, this is the society that's going through success. And then they would start losing their confidence in their deen. Start losing confidence in their deen because they don't know how to separate between the aqeedah that a person is carrying and the tool that they are using for successes. The tool that they are using. So, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us and calls Fir'aun or calls all those nations, Qawm Ad, Qawm Thamud, etc., call them people of Jahiliyyah. Why would you call them people of Jahiliyyah when you had just recognized that they had great architecture / intellect? You recognize that they definitely mastered science. They definitely mastered a lot of education. They were not stupid. Yet you still call them Jahiliyyah. Why would you do that? He said that's contradictory. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, wait a minute. They might have figured out the duels of dunya in building structure, architecture, probably medicine, probably engineering, chemistry, like the pharaohs, etc. But that doesn't mean that they mastered the purpose of their dunya and how to get to akhirah, because that's a different tool that could only be learned through wahy. You could learn science, you could learn rocket science, you can learn medicine, you could learn all of that. Regardless of your faith, you can excel. Regardless of your faith, that's a sunnah min sunan al-kawn. You learn physics, you study physics, you become a master in physics. You learn medicine, you become a master in medicine. But becoming a master in medicine, physics, whatever it is, that's knowing how the whole dunya is structured, or at least how the laws that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in this life, how they work. But that doesn't mean that you necessarily have the key to how to get to akhirah. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا يغرنك. Be careful. Don't be fooled. Don't get manipulated by seeing their capacities, the privileges, what they do, by seeing them taqallub, by seeing that they're getting political advantages, military advantages, or probably science, medicine. Don't get manipulated by that. In other words, don't confuse the different areas. Why? متاع قليل. That's just متاع قليل. متاع. Why do you call it متاع? It's like, yeah, they probably got a privilege. It's a متاع. It's a moment of joy. No, قليل. It's very minimal. ثم مأواهم جهنم. ثم later. I know that was supposed to be an iqama, but then they were supposed to do the adhan. That was the adhan. The adhan is wrong. That was.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
So, الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. ألف لام را تلك آيات الكتاب المبين إنا أنزلناه قرآنا عربيا لعلكم تعقلون نحن نقص عليك أحسن القصص بما أوحينا إليك هذا القرآن وإن كنت من قبله لمن الغافلين إذ قال يوسف لأبيه يا أبت إني رأيت 11 كوكبا والشمس والقمر رأيتهم لي قال يا بني لا تقصص رؤياك على إخوتك فيكيدوا لك كيدا إن الشيطان للإنسان عدو مبين وكذلك يجتبيك ربك ويعلمك من تأويل الأحاديث ويتم نعمته عليك وعلى آل يعقوب كما أتمها على أبويك من قبل إبراهيم وإسحاق إن ربك عليم حكيم لقد كان في يوسف وإخوته آيات للسائلين إذ قالوا ليوسف وأخوه أحب إلى أبينا منا ونحن عصبة إن أبانا لفي ضلال مبين الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر.
أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. القارعة ما القارعة وما أدراك ما القارعة يوم يكون الناس كالفراش المبثوث وتكون الجبال كالعهن المنفوش فأما من ثقلت موازينه فهو في عيشة راضية وأما من خفت موازينه فأمه هاوية وما أدراك ما هي نار حامية. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
No, no. I can see from here. They're actually very good. I am doing too. But I'll see. Linda, she's playing. She's very young though. Huh? All the time last minute. They took it aside. You guys are going to laugh a lot in general. You're a natural at jokes.
So what I'm gonna do, I'm going to just do those two ayat, ladies,
Yes, yes.
because I definitely don't want to stop at a scary place, right?
Yeah.
So, okay,
The 10 ayats are good to do, but then this is scary. It's not
yeah, very scary. Let's continue. متاع قليل ثم مأواهم جهنم. متاع قليل. What is المتاع القليل? It's basically التقلب. So that is متاع قليل. What is التقلب? التقلب is basically the privileges, the advantages that they're probably getting, that they're getting in this dunya. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling, well, yes, there is a privilege. There's definitely some success that they might be getting, but that's متاع قليل. It's just very minimal. It's small. ثم مأواهم جهنم. Yet on Judgment Day, ثم مأواهم جهنم. Then on Judgment Day, they're ending. They're مأواهم. المأوى is basically the place that you would dwell in. That's المأوى. Jahannam. Jahannam is basically hellfire. وبئس المهاد. What is بئس? بئس is the opposite of ni'mah. So بئس المهاد. What's the difference between المأوى and المهاد? المهاد comes from المهد. Mahada. In fact, the baby's crib, or the place where a baby sleeps in, is actually called al-mahd. So this is mihad, to actually mean the place where they would be sleeping in, the place where there would be their, of course, this is being satire, where they will be resting in. This is being sarcastic, okay? So bi'sa al-mihad, so here it's going to be al-ma'wa. It's going to be their final shelter. It's going to be their final stay. And it's going to be the worst place of state, worst place of state. لكن الذين اتقوا ربهم. What is this one? لكن is giving an objection. Now it's object, or giving a contrast, not objection, but a contrast. So لكن الذين اتقوا, giving you the opposite, in contrast for these people that are probably getting to, some form of a success in this dunya, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لكن الذين اتقوا ربهم. Yet compare الذين اتقوا ربهم in contrast to الذين كفروا. For those that اتقوا ربهم, for those that had taqwa, for those that had been living in consideration of the Lord Almighty. In other words, they were always aware of the Lord Almighty's principles. تقوا ربهم لهم جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار. They actually would have جنات تجري من تحتها. But wasn't that already said previously? So yes, it was said previously, but this is to compare what people would see in this dunya as the final success. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then is comparing the hal or the status and the situation that الذين كفروا would be in with the status that الذين اتقوا would be in where they would be in جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها. خالدين فيها meaning living eternally there. نزلا من عند الله. Why نزلا? That's in contrast to the words مأوى and مهاد. In nuzul is the place that you would be staying in, but it's giving in nuzul the place that you would be staying in, kind of like compartment or kind of like a place where it's a nuzul. It's a what do they actually call those areas? They're rest places. Well, not rest places. They're kind of like hotels and stuff.
Motel.
No, hotels. Okay, so kind of like hotels and where they would have services and all those would be resorts. There you go. So nuzul is kind of like a resort, right? من عند الله. It's a resort from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وما عند الله خير للأبرار. And what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give is basically better for al-abrar. In other words, there's even more than that. But here's a question. So isn't that nuzulan min indillah wa ma inda Allahi khayrul abrar? Does this mean that this is different than that? No, this what is indillah khayrul abrar is not different than this. This is basically commenting on in nuzulan min indillah, saying, well, the resorts, the places of stay, when it's near Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what is happening to these people? They're not near Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No, they're distanced. These are distance. But the mu'mineen are indillah. They're near Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Khayrul lil abrar. In other words, it's even better. In other words, there's even more than what you were told about in Jannah. وَإِنَّ مِنْ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ لَمَنْ يُؤْمِنُ بِاللَّهِ وَمَا أُنْزِلَ إِلَيْكُمْ وَمَا أُنْزِلَ إِلَيْهِمْ خَاشِعِينَ لِلَّهِ لَا يَشْتَرُونَ بِآيَاتِ اللَّهِ ثَمَنًا قَلِيلًا وَإِنَّ مِنْ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ. And that from the people of the book who would, there are those that would believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala وَمَا أُنْزِلَ إِلَيْكُمْ, and what was revealed unto you. So what does that mean? Some people of Ahlul Kitab could be believers even though they're actually not believing the Prophet ﷺ. No, this is not what it means. That's why this ayah is actually emphasizing to be a believer. It's not enough to be part of Ahlul Kitab, but it is part of faith to actually believe in Allah and even believe in وَمَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْكُمْ, and even believe in the Prophet ﷺ. All right, this is a condition of faith. If Ahlul Kitab or the people of the book, if they did not believe in the Prophet ﷺ, that would simply mean that their faith is missing a very important portion of it, which is belief in the Prophet ﷺ and to complete their belief. وَمَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْهِمْ خَاشِعِينَ لِلَّهِ. So from Ahlul Kitab, what about them? Well, there are some that would believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what was revealed unto the Prophet ﷺ, or what was revealed unto the Muslims, and what was revealed unto them, خَاشِعِينَ لِلَّهِ, where they would actually have khushu'ah. What do Ahlul Kitab have to do with this surah? Because most of the surah was actually speaking about Ahlul Kitab anyways. So this surah is now sealing the surah. Now that we had mentioned Ahlul Kitab, and now that we had mentioned the Yahud and the Christians, etc., well, that's why that ayah is telling you, well, listen, Yes, they believe in a portion of it, but they will not be considered believers unless they actually believe what was revealed onto you, Muhammad sallam, and what was revealed onto them from the scriptures that were revealed onto the rest of the prophets. And they have to be khashi'ina lillah. They have to have al-khushu'. What is al-khushu'? Al-khushu' is great conviction to the Lord Almighty, the feeling where their intellect, their senses are all connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And لا يشترون بآيات الله ثمنا قليلا. They would not make a trade-off with the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with any low trade. In other words, they recognize that the value of Jannah, there's no worth trade-off than Jannah, because there's nothing is worth as Jannah. So they would not accept any value to give up on their deen. Those are the true mu'mineen. Why was it actually mentioning that? Because remember in Surah Al-Imran, it's talking about how the Yahud, in order to continue with their political status, military status, economical status, that they had basically made the choice not to reveal the truth of what their scripture had actually contained about the Prophet ﷺ. So they kept it private, they kept it concealed, and kept it secret, because they didn't want anyone embracing that, and that would probably be at the expense of their own superior position. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasizes, أُولَٰئِكَ لَهُمْ أَجْرُهُمْ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ. Those are the people that would get the reward from their Lord Almighty. إِنَّ اللَّهَ سَرِيعُ الْحِسَابِ. So why is it سَرِيعُ الْحِسَابِ when just Judgment Day by itself, it's probably taken 50 to 100,000 years? How is that fast? Well, that's fast compared to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's timing, not compared to you. To you, you weigh things based on your life. So your life is short, but the Lord Almighty will rule and judge and hold people accountable faster than you actually think. يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. So what should we do? Then, therefore, اصبروا, صابروا, ورابطوا. Three things. اصبروا, be patient. صابروا. What is صابروا? How is اصبروا different than صابروا? How are they even different? اصبروا is where you endure the pain despite the challenge. You might get unemployment. You might end up getting unemployed because you didn't want the haram job. You might lose a lot of different things. You might end up needing to leave the beautiful life and probably the West and all the privileges and go to probably a Muslim country with less privileges just because you wanted the akhirah. So what happens? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, isbiru. In order to maintain your deen, you have to recognize that there's going to be a price to pay, a price of endurance, a price of patience. Sabiru. Now, sabiru, there are two explanations. The first explanation said sabiru in the state of jihad. When there is a challenge, when there is a battle, that you would maintain your patience, your courage during that state. The other explanation is sabiru, even if you cannot get to the level of really being a patient person. Il-musabara, the Prophet ﷺ actually said in the hadith that إنما الحلم بالتحلم. And of course, الصبر بالتصبر والعلم بالتعلم. This is not a hadith in this quote. Okay? But when you actually look at إنما الحلم بالتحلم, this is a hadith. What is الحلم? الحلم is forbearance. Someone harmed you, you're capable of retaliating, but you choose not to retaliate. So what do? You basically contain yourself to live the principle despite the fact that you're capable of retaliating. You know that you're so angry, you could really retaliate from that person, but you choose to live the principle. الصبر بالتصبر. What is it, الصبر بالتصبر? Although you probably are not really doing a good job, or at least being patient, but you are pretending. Let me use a different word than pretending. You are trying to maintain a level of patience, but you know on the inside that you're about to break. You know that on the inside that it's more than what you can handle. But you're enduring and putting in all the effort despite the fact that it's probably more than what you can handle. And that's why Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam, he said, فَصَبْرٌ جَمِيلٌ وَاللَّهُ الْمُسْتَعَانُ عَلَى مَا تَصِفُونَ. Why فَصَبْرٌ جَمِيلٌ? Sabr al-Jameel basically means beautiful patience. Why beautiful patience? Because you can get angry, but beautiful patience. So yes, somebody stepped on your foot. It was really painful. You tried to endure the pain, but beautiful patience is in not being impulsive. Okay? In other words, if you're screaming, yelling, and harming the others that probably inflicted some pain on you, that's not beautiful patience. You just gave up on your patience. Patience is living the principle, living the manners, and embracing the manners and not being impulsive. What is impulsive? Letting your emotions basically speak the wrong behavior. All right? Or let's say somebody had, death of a loved one, and then they start, why did God let this happen to me? Why me? That's not patience. That's not helping you. Yeah, well, me talking like that, it just helps me ventilate. That's not ventilation. That's tasakhut. What is it, tasakhut? Tasakhut is a form of complaining and cursing. This actually it's actually more found in women, which is why the Prophet ﷺ actually said in the hadith, تكثرن اللعن وتكفرن العشير. What is تكثرن اللعن? تكثرن اللعن means you damn things all the time. You complain too much. وتكفرن العشير. And even when someone does good to you, you basically would deny that there was any good done. She would always say, oh, no, you didn't do this thing. I'm actually the one struggling and suffering to give you everything, and you're not doing anything in response. Yeah, warabatu. What is al-murabata? Al-murabata is basically to be in a place, the place of al-thughur. What are thughur? So those are basically the most dangerous areas in a battle. They're the nearest points to the enemy. Okay, this is a riba. You're in the nearest point. Exactly, because at any minute they might actually attack and invade. So that's a riba. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, even when you're at those points, or those moments that are the most challenging, rabitu, al-murabata is, in other words, you're probably, yes, you're doing ribat, but rabitu actually means, yes, you're doing it together. There's a congregation. There's a unity. The other thing is that there is this المفاعلة in اللغة العربية, الوزن المفاعلة is basically that you're putting the effort to make this possible. Okay, you're putting the effort to make it possible. When you actually say lamasa or rabata, etc., you are putting the effort. You're struggling, but you're putting the effort to make it happen. All right, you're somehow struggling, but at least I'll try. Remember that Sahabi that would go into the war even though he's blind, really just to add a number. Like, I'm not capable of doing it, but at least I'll add a number. لعلكم واتقوا الله لعلكم تفلحون. And have taqwa. What is have taqwa? Taqwa, fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, having khushu'ah, loving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. لعلكم تفلحون. لعل, this is حرف ترجي. لعل, it's possible that you will actually be successful. Fast, I'm finished. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us from those that we do sabr, we do musabara, we do murabata, and we have taqwa, and make us from those that are muflihin. Allahumma ameen. So next week, inshallah, we won't start Surah An-Nisa. We need to party for finishing.
We do.
Right?
This is a big accomplishment.
This is a big accomplishment.
Wow.
Hudayfa has been waiting for the party since we started Surah Al-Imran. So we definitely need to party for finishing.
Exciting.
Exciting.
Okay, can we do a potluck?
A potluck? I think that's a great idea.
When?
Yeah, we could do a potluck, inshallah. Yeah, so even the people online, you could join us, probably turn on your cameras later on. Next week, show us what you had, prepared for yourself just to celebrate, right? It's worth it, right? Yeah, this Friday. What do you guys think?
I love it.
Love it? I love it too.
General halaqa.
General halaqa, there you go. Yep, inshallah. Questions, maybe just get to know one another, right? We haven't done that in a while. All right, and yeah, the people online maybe show us their knafa, maybe. What are some of the famous sweets in your country? Famous sweets in your country?
Sweets?
Yep.
Can we?
نروح الوالمارت
Can I invite you?
نروح الوالمارت Yay.
Okay.
You don't have any sweets in your country? You guys only eat meat?
Yeah, we do.
Okay.
There's one that they do with what's it called?
The balls, those bom balls.
Yeah, with
There you go.
the Nestle thing.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they
I like those.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the fried kind
The
of thing.
fried, yeah.
Yeah.
They bring it here often.
Yeah, so
What do they call that?
Perfect.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. I've been on my husband's back, convincing him to live in Mali and go to Mali.
Really?
I don't know why Mali and Chad are sounding so attractive to me.
I met
Yes.
the people who are scariest in Medina.
Not Ethiopia. My mom was telling me to go to Ethiopia, but for some reason, and I'm like, something is fishy about that place. I feel like my Islam is going to be targeted. But in Chad, I don't know why these people seem so genuine, very strong.
In Medina, they're the most scariest people I met.
The scariest people, you were really
The
scared
women
of them?
from Chad.
Okay.
They are like that.
Mauritania? I don't know. I really want to go to Chad, and I really want to go to Mali. Well, what is that? There you go, Timbuktu. Yep, there you go. Well, Sudan right now is, has all this political unrest. So I guess Sudan is out of the picture right now.
I mean, Muslim country, one after the other. It's either war or like national disaster.
Right.
one
So
after the
how is Mali?
other. It's politically unstable.
Okay,
It's struggling also with a lot of inflation.
okay,
Even though it's not very advanced economy. Because they're trying to kick out the French colony.
okay.
French is
I'll
not
help
even
them on that.
Yeah, it's not even.
Hey,
the
Friday
French
is a
out.
barbecue and I'm doing the barbecue.
You're doing a barbecue. Wait, how are you doing a barbecue? We're gonna do that at. Where are you gonna do the barbecue at?
People's in my house.
Wait, so we're not doing it here?
No.